Welcome back to our course on remote production. Following along, we are in chapter 4, and we're going to go over some core principles of video production and then some genre-specific strategies that you can use to create video that works for the application you're doing. So whether you're in sports, whether it's a house of worship, those are two very different environments, and we'll talk about some tips to make the most out of the types of streams you're doing. Let's get into it. So we have done some really cool work over the past couple of years here at StreamGeeks. And one that I want to show here is with music. And so we're going to show a music live stream and talk about the workflow there. We had a band come in and we were doing remote production, even remote audio mixing. So I'm going to show and talk a little bit about how that works. Also, we've been doing some remote productions where there's a local area network, right, set up with PTZ cameras and then remotely controlling it all in a remote location. This is the PreSonus Studio Live mixer that we've been using for these types of events, which allow you to remotely control the audio mix from anywhere in the world. And then we've been using PTZOptics Hive. And I just wanted to show a couple of these really, I'm going to say, radically different live streams. Here's another one here where we're doing live streaming of sports and we're using auto tracking cameras to follow the sports players, and we're trying to give coaches access and give for analytics, and it's a completely different type of live stream. We were using vMix here. You can see the auto tracking of a sports player here with PTZ cameras. And I just want you to kind of think about how different a live band is from sports, from a house of worship stream. And it's important to kind of call this out because as a producer, I want you to leave this course understanding some of the nuances of the different types of live streams that you might be doing and kind of what they're all about and how to be successful with those. So those are just two examples of remote production in sports, and we'll use those as case studies, but we'll go even beyond that as we go over core principles that apply to any type of live stream and video production. All right, so some of the core principles we'll go over. One is the 180-degree shutter speed rule, which allows you to get a really natural video, and I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the 180-degree camera rule. We'll talk about the rule of thirds, and then we'll just continue on so that you don't leave this course without some of the core fundamental principles of video production. Now, the 180-degree shutter speed rule is one of my favorite rules of video production because it simplifies the camera setup. Okay. Basically, a 180-degree shutter speed rule will make it so that your video looks natural. And it's possible that if you don't use the 180-degree shutter speed rule, your video will either look too blurry or too sharp. And the reason why is because the human eye is used to seeing a little blur. If there is a ball zipping by, you're going to see a blur. You're not going to see it every frame in focus. And basically, the 180-degree shutter speed rule is very straightforward. It's very easy to use. What it means is you take your frame rate. Okay, your frame rate might be 30 frames a second. It might be 60 frames a second. It might be 25 frames a second. And you double your shutter speed. So if you're streaming at 30 frames a second, you would use 1/160th of a second for your frame rate. If you're streaming in 60 frames a second, you would use 1/120th of a second. And that is how you can ensure a really good baseline for your shutter speed to have really smooth video. And so it's just such a great starting point to lock in and abide by the shutter speed rule. So then you can edit other camera features like the iris and the gain to, adjust your exposure. And we'll talk about that. But essentially, you have these three areas of your camera to start with. and its shutter speed, aperture, and gain to really dial in your exposure. And if you can just lock in your shutter speed, it saves so much time, because you can say, all right, I'm streaming in 30 frames a second. I'm going to do 1/60 for my shutter speed. That's taken care of. You don't need to worry about your shutter speed. Now that that's locked in, you can adjust your aperture and your gain to achieve what you see as a good exposure for your camera. Now, when you're setting up a camera, the aperture is essentially your f-stop, and it's how wide your camera iris is actually open. So a shallow depth of field, okay, would be ideal for portraits and artistic video. This is where you get that bokeh effect in the background, and it's actually really good for chroma keying and green screens, but things won't be as in focus in the background. Depending on what you're doing, that might be good. But a deep depth of field where everything is in focus will often have a smaller iris opening. And it's good for live news. It's good for sports. It's good when you want to see everything in focus. And so your aperture is generally what you use to kind of get that artistic look and to control how much light is coming in to your camera. Now, the shutter speed on the flip side, right, is how quickly the shutter is moving to block light from coming in. And so, it's nice that you can just abide by the 180-degree shutter speed rule, lock this in. But if you want to play around with it, the faster your shutter speed is, the more detailed and crisp moving objects will look. The lower your shutter speed, so the slower it is, the more blurry fast-moving objects will look. So something to think about depending on what you're doing here. And then, of course, another big area of getting your color correct and your color correction, which we will look at in this course, is color balance. And you want to make sure you have a balanced color. And there are tools for achieving balanced color. There are white balance modes, such as automatic, such as a one push, which we'll do in this course, to help you set the colors properly. And you'll notice that everyone has issues with color correction in video production, multiple cameras, getting them synced up together. It's easy to do once you know how, and we're going to go over some of those tools and tips in this online course. So 180-degree shutter speed rule, just to recap. You set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So if you're at 30 frames per second, you want to do the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second. And we'll look at doing that in Hive throughout this course so that you can create a natural motion blur as kind of like your baseline. Now, the next rule that I think a lot of people should think about is the 180-degree camera rule. This is specifically important in sports, but most news broadcasters will also abide by this rule, which is to keep all the cameras on one action axis, meaning if all the cameras are on one side of the field, you can naturally see which way the sport is moving, whether it be left or right. If you randomly mix in one camera from the other side of the field, suddenly a play that was going left is now going right, and it confuses and disorients viewers. So the 180-degree camera rule ensures a natural visual flow. And whether you're doing sports or a podcast, this is something to think about. It's okay to show a behind-the-scenes camera that is, behind and breaks this rule. It's okay to break this rule, but do so knowingly and think about doing it for specific situations. Like, for example, it would be okay after a play has developed during a timeout to show a video camera from the other side of the field. That's okay, because you're not disorienting viewers during the middle of a play. You're showing them a new view that's engaging and different. So it's important to understand these rules so that you can break them intelligently and, keep up with user expectations. Now, the rule of thirds is a big one, and this is to divide the frame equally into 9 parts and using 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3 of that frame to keep your subject in view. Now, in this picture here, we are looking at a professor who might be moving a little bit. So instead of putting them directly in the center third, we have them off to the side, giving them a little bit of space to lead in to the left or the right. But the rule of third really enhances the visual appeal. You want to use these thirds to think about a third for the foreground, a third for the background, a third for the subject, as a place to, kind of start your compositions. And you can see here that we're doing balanced headroom. We're giving some lead room, right? Space for a moving object to move into. And then we're also thinking about the background and giving each of these elements of your frame space to breathe. Now, before we get into camera movements, I want to show in Hive here one of these cameras, and we'll choose this one here. And you'll notice, and this is true for Hive, but this is also true for many different video production softwares, that we have these abilities to put in the crosshairs so that we can, without showing the viewer, abide by these rule of third situations. So if I wanted to zoom into myself here and keep myself in this middle third, that would probably be a pretty good shot right there, right? So I've got some headroom. I'm in the middle third. I'm not moving, so there's no reason to have a lot of space to the left or right of me. This would be a good shot abiding by the rule of thirds. Now, when we talk about camera movements, so if you're moving cameras, that's great. Camera movement is good, but you want to avoid a lot of unnecessary movement. So you want your movement to be very intentional. And I'm going to show a couple tools here when we do this, but avoid unnecessary zooms, unnecessary pans. Oftentimes you want to do the camera movements before you transition to an output, right? So you can move a camera off camera, if you will, or off live, and then cut to the camera once it's already been moved. And I'll show you an example of two camera movement tools here. Let's say I need to move the camera from one spot to another. Well, Hive has a fast frame tool where we can click, all right, I need to move it to that LinkedIn pillow as fast as possible. Well, we would use the fast frame tool to do that and get it in there as quickly as we could. And then we cut to it, right? So we use the fast frame tool to quickly move the camera, and then we cut to that camera once the movement has happened. If we want to do on-camera movement, then we would use the cinematic framing tool, which is going to do a much slower, finer movement. So if we go ahead and move this now, it's going to pan, tilt, and zoom all at the same speed to do a finer PTZ movement. So when you're doing pan, tilt, and zoom on camera, you want it to be more smooth and cinematic. When you're doing it off camera, you often just want it to move as quickly as possible to the place that you need it. So just something to think about from a camera movement perspective. When you're using transitions, okay, video transitions, a cut is the most popular transition. It directly switches in the blink of an eye from one camera to the next. And if you look at broadcasts and streams, you'll notice that a cut is used 90, maybe 95% of the time. Other transitions that are more fancy, like a fade, which I'll use a fade here. See that fade? We're going to fade back and forth. Those are reserved more for gentle scene transitions. Like, it makes sense to go from a PowerPoint to a live video with a fade, right? Or a merge. But you want to avoid doing too many fancy transitions where you're doing cube zooms and wipes and different things. You don't need to do so much of that. That's more for artistic shows, and you really want to leverage the cuts and the fades. You'll notice when you start taking a look at this type of things that crossfades, for example, are often used during like a national anthem, right? Where they're crossfading between one thing or the next in a sports environment. But they're not used that often when you're looking at all the transitions and cuts in aggregate. So just something to consider there. So now let's take a look at genre-specific streams, techniques here that are tailored to specific environment. So in an educational environment where the viewers are going to actually learn something, you probably do want to use multi-camera angles to keep them engaged. You want to have really high quality audio so that everyone can really hear well what is being presented. And you probably want to mix on-screen graphics with live video and captions if you can, to really accommodate the widest variety of learners. And so from an educational perspective, we're really trying to use the audio and video to connect with viewers. Now, from an entertainment content perspective, we're trying to captivate a live viewer audience. So multiple cameras is necessary. You might even be using wireless cameras and steady cameras to really hone in on providing experiential experiences. And you might be using multiple microphones and really mixing together a lot of different things together to create these visual effects. So it's much different than education. Here we really have a lot of artistic creativity for entertainment. Now in House of Worship, we're really trying to bring people into a meaningful environment where we really have to respect the environment and we really have to try to hone in on the content and what's being spoken. So having discrete cameras like PTZ cameras that are small and moving them intentionally is important, and having high quality microphones that can capture what's going on in this dynamic space is important. You'll often find that lyrics and scripture are being spoken and sung in worship. So in combining these presenter and presentations and PowerPoints and the lyrics actually can be quite powerful when done properly. In live sports, this should be a sports image, and it's just still a house of worship. But in live sports, we want to apply that house of worship environment. We want to have in live sports, we want to have strategic camera placements. So we might want to have an end zone camera. We might want to have provide the 180 degree camera placement rule. We're going to be working with instant replays so we can replay these things in slow motion. We might be working more with graphics and statistics and commentary. So again, these productions change quite a bit. And when you're doing productions, I want you guys to remember that, it's important to work in a team, and you might want to delegate some of these responsibilities because it's more than any one person can do when these streams get larger. So you might want to delegate and split up camera operations from social media connectivity and chat room, collaboration and communication. The production, the switching, and the technical setup, these might all be different people. And the great thing about remote production is you can bring these people in and they don't have to actually come on site and fly in. You can have a remote camera operator, you can have a remote audio mixer, and you can have remote teams collaborating in a single production. So some of the things to prep and be prepared for is setting up PTZ camera presets, and we'll show that later on in this course. Having set up meetings and using controllers, whether it be a PTZ camera controller or a Stream Deck or an X Keys, but putting the tools in front of your team so that they can truly control all of this, whether it be on-site or remote, is obviously important. So the key takeaways here are to, have an effective task distribution to work with your team, understand some of these core principles and share them with your team, select the appropriate video transitions when you're doing that live production, and think about the type of stream you're doing and really research it and do some homework on the difference between the sports stream that you might be used to and the house of worship stream that you're about to do, or vice versa, so that you can really have a good sense of what makes the viewer most engaged, because the viewer is ultimately the customer. All right, we are going to start digging into some of the more important topics of remote production, including bandwidth, bit rates, encoding, etc. So I'll see you in the next video.